Most of the Russian stragglers retreating towards Stalingrad would have agreed with this estimate of the situation. Disillusioned, desperate, they had been reduced to fighting each other for scraps of food and water, especially water, which was scarce on the barren steppe. At precious watering holes, they found another enemy had been there before them, the Kalmuks, natives to the region and intensely anti-communist, had thrown dead animals into the wells. The poisoned water quickly killed unwary drinkers. But it appears that the Soviets weren't the only ones suffering in this heat. Between the 21st of July 1942, which was the beginning of this series, and the 10th of August 1942, 6th Army had lost a total of 20,335 men. This was relatively little compared to the Red Army that they had faced. However, the losses were mounting. And what's really interesting is that 4,761 of these lost soldiers had been sent home as sick. That's a very large portion of the losses. What is striking are the high losses for Paulus's army in sick, which is atypical, for example, compared to the summer of 1941. In some formations, the losses due to sickness are comparable to combat losses. While it isn't the only factor, it does appear that some of the German troops were drinking poisoned water from the wells or consuming contaminated food, since supplies were limited and the German soldiers were living off the land, a land which had been gutted by the Soviets. The supply lines extended and we were undersupplied. Consequently, the hunger started long before we even reached Stalingrad in the Don steppe. Sudden rains, while temporarily turning tracks to mire, did little to solve the water shortage, which was the main preoccupation of the German Landwehr during this time. The Red Army polluted wells during the retreat, and cattle were driven to the rear. The Russians have poured petrol over the grain supplies, a corporal wrote home on the 10th of August. One German doctor with the 6th Army described the situation. "We had shortcomings of all sorts, and our rations were halved too. We got orders to live off the land, but there was barely any agriculture between the Don and the Volga. If we came across a kolkhoz, a collective farm, there was nothing to be found. It was emptied. We couldn't live off the land, but we had been a horse-drawn unit. Slowly but steadily, we would eat our horses, long before we would even reach Stalingrad. Motorized units had it worse. Their cooking pots stayed empty. In the steppe there was barely any water. Finding a slough was a rarity, and they were dirty. The men got attacks of fever and diarrhea. We had to run our disinfection apparatus constantly, but it was far too small. If you wanted to eat, everything was black immediately because of all the flies. It was an awful plague. We couldn't do anything against it. The plague was following us when we were marching on. The flies were following the horses. Either they or the lice probably transmitted the trench fever. It was vicious. The men got joint pain in their knees, in their legs, and their kidneys got attacked too. We had no medication against it. Cases of dysentery, typhus and paratyphus began to increase. Around field ambulances, cookhouses and especially butchery sections, the plague of flies was horrible, reported one doctor. They were most dangerous for those with open wounds, such as the burns of tank crewmen. The continual movement forward made it very difficult to care for the sick and wounded. Evacuation by a Sanitas U air ambulance was the best hope, but Hitler's insistence on speed meant that almost every transport aircraft had been diverted to deliver fuel to the halted panzer divisions. Dysentery is caused by consuming contaminated food or water, while typhus is contracted by being bitten by fleas or lice. So it does appear that disease was plaguing the 6th Army at this time. However, there is further evidence that at least some of the sick were actually men suffering from exhaustion after the long fighting in scorching weather. It is clear that those divisions that suffered the heaviest were committed from the very beginning of the battle in the bend of the Don, and essentially became victims of mistakes in evaluating the enemy. We have paid a high price for our success. The hard fighting and the heavy losses are getting on the soldiers' nerves. There is widespread depression. Clearly though, if the Germans were suffering from a lack of water, food, and were being struck down by disease and depression, then the Red Army was also suffering in a similar fashion. Unfortunately, I don't have the number of sick for the Soviet side for this period, but there are plenty of contemporary accounts that suggest that this was the case. There was constant bombing by the Germans, and in the chaotic conditions, no food got to us. We were trying to survive on emergency rations, and the heat was terrible. I had a constant desire to drink. We found most of the wells dried out, passing through a succession of semi-deserted villages, and occasionally found bitter, brackish water at the bottom of a well. We'd reach a habitable place, and there'd be no water in the wells, only silt. We drew that silt and dumped it into bowls, from which a thin layer of water could be poured into one bowl and given to the wounded. A second bowl for the machine gun, a third, already mostly silt, for ourselves. It's embarrassing to admit what we ate. The wheat had already ripened. As we retreated, we'd pull an ear of wheat and chew the grains. For chow, they'd given us wheat and buckwheat concentrate, but you need water to prepare it, and there was none. You need fire to cook porridge or soup, but there isn't a twig in sight, it's the steppe. The Germans say it's not the Don where Russians will suffer the most, but the Volga. The Germans promise to drown us all in the Volga. My dear Katya, my dear children, it's hard to stay alive here. It seems we are all sentenced to death. There's nowhere else to go. We either drown or be killed or taken prisoner by the enemy. It will be a massacre at Stalingrad. The impact of all of this was very telling on the formations. The available forces seem very weak for subsequent operations against Stalingrad. The 297th, 44th and 113th Infantry Divisions and the 100th Jaeger Division have been greatly weakened by losses. I saw the casualty reports that had been prepared in writing by the divisions. I went myself to those that had suffered the most. Many companies of the 376th Infantry Division had a fighting strength of only 25 men. Things were a little better in the 44th and 384th Infantry Divisions, but companies with fighting strengths of between 35 and 40 men gave no cause for optimism. Focusing on what Adam reported to be the worst hit division, between the 21st of July and the 10th of August, 376th Infantry Division had lost 101 men killed, 357 men wounded, had 47 missing men, and 290 sick. That's 795 in total. But that was nothing compared to what the 100th Jaeger Division had suffered, which had taken the most losses since the fighting began out of all the divisions in 6th Army, although less sick. In reference to the Germans only, Army Group B had taken 30,827 combat losses throughout July, yet had received just 19,400 replacements. That's 2 entire divisions worth of losses, and even with the replacements, they're an entire division down at this point in terms of manpower. So again, losses were heavy and units were short, and they still hadn't got to the city yet. Adam states that Paulus had spoken to his unit commanders, and all of them regarded fresh replacements as their biggest concern. Adam even took a plane to see the Führer, but he failed in his mission to get more soldiers sent their way. Clearly, for the Germans, things did not bode well for the future. But for the 12th of August 1942, things had quietened down. Paulus's 6th Army continued to process its newly won prisoners, those that it had obtained after destroying the Kalach pocket. 26 Soviet aircraft did fly over German airfields in the area to bomb them, but 25 of them were shot down, apparently for no losses to 8th Flieger Corps. To help the southern sector out, Yeremenko assigned the 66th Naval Rifle Brigade to Chuikov. This brigade was currently on the right flank of his southern operational group, and giving Chuikov this brigade meant that he could concentrate on holding the western half of 64th Army's area, whilst Shumilov could concentrate on stopping the 48th Panzer Corps and its advances further to the east. Also, Chuikov's holding of the Aksay River area effectively split the efforts of 4th Panzer Army into two, with the Romanians in the west and the German forces to the east. This prevented Hoth's forces from concentrating their strength and helped to stall his advance. It was also during this time that Chuikov was beginning to get a grasp of German tactics. He started to formulate responses against their attacks, which he would later use to great effect in Stalingrad itself. Believing their methods to be infallible, the Germans followed exactly the same pattern. Air attack, then artillery, then infantry, then tanks. They did not know any other order in which to attack. He developed a tactic where he would withdraw his men a short distance when the Germans prepared for an attack. This would allow them to avoid the initial artillery and Luftwaffe airstrikes, preserving his force for when the main combat started. Again, another reason why the fighting outside the city of Stalingrad is important to study and shouldn't be ignored. In other news, the Bryansk and Voronezh fronts launched an offensive to retake the Voronezh Bulge. This effort distracted the Germans and forced them to keep significant forces in their rear areas along the Don to stiffen the Hungarian Second Army and then also the Italian 8th Army, who were still moving into the area. So, even at this stage, the large northern flank that Army Group B was covering was already beginning to cause the Axis problems. Again, this didn't bode well for the future. But for Paulus, the immediate problem was to get the advance going towards Stalingrad again. It had become clear to him as early as the 7th of August that a drive on Stalingrad could not be conducted whilst there was major Soviet forces situated on his northern flank. A preliminary condition of any offensive against Stalingrad is the rout of the enemy in the Don Bend facing the 8th Army Corps, insofar as in the opposite case, any offensive will be flanked from the north and our major forces will be tied down. He'd also been ordered by the High Command to clear the Don Bend first before striking towards the city on the Volga, so Paulus intended to do just that. Therefore, most of his forces now began to move north in preparation for this next attack, which was codenamed Operation Nord. Not all of Paulus's units moved north. 71st Infantry Division would continue to guard the Don's western bank, as it had done previously, although now this flank stretched almost up towards Kalach. This was fine, however, since the Soviet forces on the opposite bank were in no position to launch attacks, due to the fact that 64th Army was busy trying to contain 4th Panzer Army to the south. The 44th Infantry Division also started to relieve 3rd Motorised Division's units along the Don, freeing them up for the next attack. The units opposite 44th Infantry Division were the 131st and 399th Rifle Divisions, both of which had been shattered and had fled from the Kalach area. And there was the 20th Motorised Rifle Brigade, which was busy guarding Kalach. None of these units were a real threat to Dubois' division. But the main exceptions to Paulus's shift north were the 297th Infantry and 24th Panzer Divisions. These were now sent south to reinforce Hoth's 4th Panzer Army with the intention of getting his advance going again towards Stalingrad from the south. This was a major deduction from the 6th Army, but they probably weren't needed for Operation Nord, since Kryuchunkin's 4th Tank Army wasn't a tank army anymore. Yes, the 22nd Tank Corps was there on paper, but in reality it had been reduced to 1 brigade in strength. This, the 182nd Tank Brigade, with its 10 T-34s, 20 T-60s and 6 T-70s, could hardly justify the name of a tank army, and its 18th, 184th, 192nd, 205th and 321st Rifle Divisions were simply not at full strength. The 184th and 192nd Rifle Divisions had been engaged in fighting since the beginning of this series, with the 192nd having guarded the Kletskaya area and been shattered by Paulus's first attack on the 23rd of July. This was why, instead of having their full authorized strength of 10,386 men, the 192nd was down to 4,965 men, while the 184th had just 3,950. Yes, the other divisions hadn't been so heavily engaged, with the 321st having only just arrived, but they weren't at full strength either. The 18th Rifle Division had 8,724 men, the 205th had 8,374, and the 321st, again having only just arrived, had only 7,544 men at this time. The Soviets knew that an attack against 4th Tank Army was bound to come soon, but lacking accurate information about where the German armoured and motorised units were concentrating, they didn't know where to focus their defences. And by this point, 1st Guards Army was meant to have taken up positions behind the Don, but its ex-airborne Guards divisions had not yet arrived. So, to reinforce Kryuchunkin's practically tankless tank army, Danilov's 21st Army now ordered the 343rd Rifle Division across the Don to the western flank of the bridgehead. This would barely arrive in time to face Paulus's attack, although it was better than nothing. Kryuchenkin also had the 5th Destroyer Regiment and some other anti-tank and artillery units, but clearly Soviet forces were ill prepared for what was about to hit them. 13th of August 1942, 45 Soviet aircraft bombed German airfields once more, but only 10 of these made it back home. In contrast, 8th Flieger Corps reported 0 losses for this action. In fact, the Germans claimed a total of 159 Soviet aircraft shot down on the 12th to 13th of August, with the Soviets themselves realizing that their attempt to bomb German airfields had completely failed. By this point, Richthofen's air kill claims in the Don region up to the 13th of August had reached 606 Soviet aircraft in the air and another 107 on the ground, for a total of 713 aircraft claimed destroyed. The reality was probably somewhat different. Soviet records indicate that they had lost 230 aircraft during the period of the 20th of July to the 10th of August. So Richthofen's men were claiming way more kills than they were actually taking out. But to be fair, all sides seem to do this. I've shown this before in the North African campaign, for example. In fact, the Soviet air claims for this period were just as exaggerated. They said that they shot down 187 Bf-109s up to the 10th of August, whilst German records show just 62 had been destroyed or forced to land due to damage. Clearly then, the statistics on both sides of this conflict cannot be entirely trusted. As a starter to Paulus's main offensive, 11th Army Corps' 376th Infantry Division and elements of 100th Jaeger Division on the western side of the line mounted a diversionary attack. This actually forced the 321st and the 343rd Rifle Divisions to withdraw, and fearing the worst, Kryuchunkin sent in reinforcements, the 5th Destroyer Brigade and other anti-tank regiments, to try and stabilise the situation. Of course, this attack had been designed to draw off Soviet reinforcements to the western flank and away from the centre where the main part of the attack would take place, and it had worked like a charm. On the 14th of August 1942, in 40 degrees of heat, Paulus's units had reached their starting positions in preparation to join 11th Army Corps in its attack. By this point, Gordov had reacted to the events and also ordered the 193rd Tank Brigade with 25 tanks and the 22nd Anti-Tank Artillery Brigade, as well as additional anti-tank regiments, to the 4th Tank Army as reinforcements. These reinforcements would arrive on the 15th, just in time to face Paulus's main attack. Meanwhile, to the south, 24th Panzer Division drove through 250 kilometers of sandstorms, dust and heat to reach the railway line at Aksay. And at about the same time, Chirikov was ordered to begin a phased withdrawal from his positions on the Aksay to avoid a potential encirclement. Otherwise, the southern front remained as it was on this day. 15th of August 1942. A clear but windy day with the temperature reaching 58 degrees, probably not taken in the shade. However, the battle did heat up though as Paulus's main course begins. A Stuka attack with a 2-hour artillery bombardment peppered the Soviet lines before Heitz's 8th Army Corps committed to the assault at 0430 hours. Lashing out from the middle of the front, Oppenlender's 305th Infantry Division locked horns with Makarenko's 205th Rifle Division, whilst Yenika's 389th Infantry Division assaulted the positions of Zhuravlev's depleted 192nd Rifle Division. The 384th Infantry Division took on the remains of the 184th Rifle Division and seized 3 hills in the area, although their losses were high with over 300 casualties being recorded. Nevertheless, the Soviet lines were on the brink of collapse. And that's when the 16th Panzer, 60th Motorized and 3rd Motorized Divisions, themselves assisted by the Luftwaffe, rolled forwards. Moving through 8th Army Corps' units, they sliced through the defences of the 184th, 192nd and 205th Rifle Divisions, shattering them completely. They pushed the entire front back, and at noon, Huber's 16th Panzer Division drove into and overran Kryuchunkin's headquarters, depriving the general of all control of what remained of his army. For all of this, Huber's division took about 100 casualties, and 3rd Motorized Division suffered just 2 men killed in action, which just goes to show how one-sided this fight really was. To the southeast, Seregin's 18th Rifle Division, struck by 2 German divisions, was battered and pushed back, with its 424th Rifle Regiment being encircled and wiped out. 182nd Tank Brigade was thrown in to stabilise the situation slightly to the north, but the few tanks it had stood no chance and heavy losses were taken. German units in this area had captured Akhimovsky by the end of the day. And to the west, 376th Infantry and 100th Jaeger Divisions, who had gained some ground 2 days before, pushed forward again, this time reinforced by the Croatian Legion and Weber's 54th Regiment, who had marched up from the south. Ground was taken, but because Kryuchunkin had reinforced this area, these 2 divisions faced stiff resistance and both took heavy casualties this day. Even so, Paulus's overwhelming force was too much for the Soviet lines. A breakthrough had occurred, and by nightfall, Kolomen's 60th Motorized Division had reached the southern bank of the Don south of Sirotinskaya. The forward elements of Huber's 16th Panzer Division had also reached the Don at Trekostrovskaya, and so 4th Tank Army was now split in 2. On the steppe, they were always toying with us during our retreat. At night time, they sent out machine gunners on motorbikes with a lot of ammunition to create a lot of noise and make us believe we were encircled. We would call them the night actors. But some of our troops were frightened when they saw flare rockets or heard the sound of firing behind them and panicked and left their positions. Realizing the scale of the disaster, and pressured by the Stavka and Yeremenko, Gordov ordered Moskalenko's 1st Guards Army to send in its 37th, 38th, 39th and 40th Guards Rifle Divisions into battle. Getting off their trains at Ilovlia Station, the ex-paratroopers now crossed into the Don bridgehead to reinforce Kryuchunkin's crumbling forces. Of course, with the Germans at the crossing at Trekostrovskaya, it would be difficult to get these forces across the Don, meaning, once again, that Soviet divisions would be drip-fed into the battlefield rather than allowed to form a coherent defensive or offensive force. And then Gordov ordered a counterattack to be conducted, to begin on the 17th of August in 2 days' time. In the north, 40th Guards Rifle Division and the 321st, 205th and 343rd Rifle Divisions were ordered onto the attack, with 62nd Division of 21st Army to also strike against the left wing of Paulus's forces. In the south, 37th and 39th Guards Divisions, the 18th Rifle Division, and 182nd Tank Brigade of 22nd Tank Corps were to attack as well. The newly arrived 98th and 214th Rifle Divisions, as well as the 193rd Tank Brigade with its 25 tanks, were to cross the Don at Vertiachi overnight on the 15th to 16th of August. Once across, these would attack westwards towards Rodionov. So, as always, Soviet forces would be thrown in desperately to try and stem the Axis onslaught. On the 16th, another dry, sunny day, 14th Panzer Corps continued moving into the Don Bend. Assisted by Huber's panzers, Schlomer smashed Guriev's 39th Rifle Division, and Zolodev's 37th Guards Rifle Division crumbled under the weight of Kuhlmann's tyres. 100th Jaeger and 376th Infantry Divisions also resumed their attacks against the reinforced Soviet line. The resistance of the Russians remained stubborn, and despite support from tanks and assault guns, it was not easy to drive the enemy out of his earth bunkers. Not even artillery fire had any effect. The armour had to drive up to 20 to 30 metres and put their shells directly into them in order to destroy the enemy resistance nests. But despite Soviet efforts, the 100th Jaeger and 376th Infantry Divisions managed to force back the 321st, 343rd and 205th Rifle Divisions, with 376th Infantry Division capturing Kremenskaya itself. By the end of the day, the 343rd Rifle Division was down to just 230 men from the 8,677 men it had had the day before, and now could hardly be called a battalion, let alone a division. These Soviet divisions were now pushed back into a narrow strip of land on the southern bank of the Don. It was only with the arrival of the 38th and 40th Guards Rifle Divisions that the remnants of these Soviet divisions weren't annihilated by Strecker's 11th Army Corps. Pastrievich's 40th Guards Rifle Division fought to hold Sirotinskaya itself, but Oppenländer had ripped it from their hands by the end of the day. On one of the hills in the area was Kotchetkov's 2nd Company from the 11th Guards Rifle Regiment. The German 576th Infantry Regiment from the 305th Infantry Division assaulted the hill, and Kotchetkov's company was reduced to just 16 guardsmen by the end of the day. However, they still held the hill. Yenica was now engaging Zolodev's battered 37th Guards Rifle Division as the 295th and 76th Infantry Divisions seized footholds on the eastern bank of the Don. The 384th Infantry Division, with the 855th Heavy Artillery Detachment and a battery from the 244th Sturmgeschütz Battalion, battled against the 22nd Motorized Rifled Brigade and managed to seize a small bridgehead over the Don. The Soviets sent in waves of bombers over this bridgehead and in other areas to try and destroy the bridges. German fighters had to give constant support in order to keep the crossings safe. And it was during this time that a German plane crash-landed in no man's land near the Croatian Legion's lines. The plane was soon engulfed in flames. Luckily for the German pilot, legionary Sakir Soller from 4th Company ran over to help him. Schutzer Soller pulled him out of the blazing wreck just moments before the plane blew up. Soller was treated to a feast in his honour at the airbase of the squadron. He got the Iron Cross 2nd Class and was granted a 20-day leave period. Also withdrawing this evening was Huber's division, which was ordered to pull back to the rear in order to rest and refit, having done a good job in the previous 2 days. On the 17th, 384th Infantry Division's small bridgehead came under pressure from several Soviet units and had to be supported by elements from the 389th Infantry Division. The two divisions would lose 300 dead against stiff Soviet resistance during this operation, in what was described by one German war correspondent as one of the most senseless actions of the entire war. It was then that Gordov's counterattack began. The 54th Jaeger Regiment became embroiled in a firefight, and the Soviets almost succeeded in causing the regiment to flee. However, Lieutenant Maull, the 54th Jaeger Regiment's adjutant, gathered a group of men, as well as pioneers from somewhere, and counterattacked. As a result of this action, the front was stabilised, and the 376th Infantry Division also fell back slightly, but otherwise Gordov's counterattack had failed to achieve anything of note. So, Paulus's forces continued to press Soviet forces back into their shrinking bridgeheads, with 100th Jaeger Division pushing northeast. 60th Motorised and 3rd Motorised Divisions threw the remnants of the 184th and 192nd Rifle Divisions across the Don, along with the reinforcing 37th Guards Rifle Division, which suffered heavy losses trying to stabilise the situation. Having completed their mission that evening, Schlomer and Kullerman were instructed to prepare their divisions to be withdrawn for rest and refit. On their hill, Kotchetkov's 16 guardsmen continued to hold on despite the heat and dust and the fact that they had no food or water. They were hit by a German artillery bombardment, followed by an assault from the 576th Infantry Regiment, supported by 12 panzers from the 160th Panzer Battalion. As the action started, Kotchetkov was struck in the eye by a bullet, but remained in his position. According to Soviet sources, which have gone down in legend, Kotchetkov's men destroyed 6 or more German tanks, with one source saying 12. Some say that a few of the panzers were taken out with anti-tank rifles. Others say they weren't. The 16 men had not a single anti-tank rifle among them, and many of them were wounded. But the legend does say that all or most of the panzers were taken out by Kotchetkov's men, who threw themselves under the tanks clutching grenades. Yeah, human grenades. A battle to the death began. One of the men threw himself with a bunch of grenades under the tracks of the first tank. The tank blew up. A second man followed, then a third and a fourth. 4 tanks stood blazing on the battlefield. The German tank crew's nerves could not stand it. Some of the tanks turned back, but 2 of them continued to move forward relentlessly. Chirikov says that reinforcements then arrived to find their dead comrades, as well as 6 burnt-out German tanks, confirming the legend that survives to this day, which says all 16 of Kotchetkov's men were killed in action. Which is impossible, because how would the rest of the Soviet Union have learnt about the specific details about the action? If the men were dead, how would their comrades know that they sacrificed themselves by throwing themselves under tanks as human grenades? Well, it seems that Chirikov himself realised this when he wrote his memoirs. Young Lieutenant Kotchetkov managed to tell the story of what happened before he died. Yes, my fiction senses are tingling. And the fact that 6 of the 16 guardsmen were awarded the Order of Lenin and the other 10 got the Order of the Red Banner doesn't convince me at all. Interestingly, it seems that their courageous action was not recorded on the German side. 160th Panzer Battalion was the only panzer force in the area and suffered 2 men killed and 19 wounded on this day, only 3 of which had serious wounds. That's probably not 6 panzers worth of casualties. Now, their panzer records may not be accurate. The Germans claim that they gained 2 additional panzers this day due to repairs, even though they suddenly lost 15 panzers a few days later when there was less action, which suggests that the tanks may have been damaged on this day. Jason DeMark, who has done a good job in assessing this action in his book Panzerkrieg, confirms this. Again, the link to his website in the description, not a sponsor. Mark says that either way, there was no record of huge German panzer losses, and he also notes that at least 2 of the 16 dead men actually survived the war. Plus, Soviet records suggest that there were more than 16 men in the area in the first place. So the legend of Kochetkov's 16 guardsmen may just be that, a legend. Or at least exaggerated. Maybe one guy did throw himself under a tank with grenades and then this tale got blown way out of proportion like he did. That seems the most likely story. But anyway, after 2 days of fighting, 4th Tank Army was no longer a fighting force. Kryuchunkin's rifle divisions had been turned into mincemeat, and Shamshin's 22nd Tank Corps had just 7 tanks left. The Germans had taken 12,800 prisoners and had finally secured the western side of the Don. Worse, both 4th Tank Army and 1st Guards Army were now out of ammunition, thanks in part to the German Luftwaffe, who were bombing the nearby railway stations to the north. So, the Soviets were exhausted, which was exactly what Paulus had wanted. The Soviets had fought to retain the remaining bridgeheads on the southern side of the Don, committing everything they had in the area for this purpose, but now they were in ruin. Although neglected in many earlier histories of Operation Blau, in part because Soviet historians either obscured or utterly ignored the subject for many years, the long struggle in the Great Bend of the Don River, lasting more than 3 weeks, was not only far more intense and costly to both sides than previously thought, but also was far more significant. Although the ensuing fighting decimated 62nd Army, it also seriously weakened 6th Army, explaining at least in part why Paulus's army would experience major difficulties when it tried to rid Stalingrad of its stubborn defenders 6 weeks later. But it wasn't just the Soviet histories which neglect this period. German sources do too. For example, Colonel Adam spends about 3 paragraphs on Operation Nord. Yes, he skipped the July battles when the Germans were in trouble, and then jumped to the August period when the 6th Army successfully cleared the Don against weak opposition. Haupt gives it a couple of pages, but his description is so vague and intermixed with fighting from the other dates, he may as well not have written it. Karl Strecker, commander of 11th Army Corps, who was there at the time, only describes the period from the 1st of August until where we are now. And he does this in 7 short sentences, and gets the dates wrong. In English history such as Little Hearts, A History of the Second World War, written in 1970, he sums up everything we've seen in the past 7 episodes in about 125 words. And in his bestseller Enemy at the Gates, Craig spends more time on this period than some of the other authors, but he's busy setting up the scene for the city fight and introducing the generals, so there's a significant lack of details on the actual fighting. But at least he mentions it. Beaver, in his popular Stalingrad book, skips Operation Nord entirely. He goes from the end of the encirclement at Kalach on the 11th straight to the 21st of August, missing a full 10 days of the battle. Seriously, if it wasn't for David Glantz and Jonathan House, Jason DeMark, Falk, and now Isaev, who just released his book in late 2019, as well as Chuikov to a lesser extent, English speakers wouldn't have anything on the period we've covered so far in this series. In fact, without their books, the first 2 seasons of this series wouldn't have been possible, and we would have had to start the series in the next episode. So, I think it's only fair for me to keep recommending their books to you. anything by Glantz, Jason DeMark, link in the description to his website, Falk if you're interested in the 64th Army, and now Isayev's book on Stalingrad will not disappoint you if you're looking for even more details on this battle. And you should be looking for more details on this battle because I can't possibly provide all of them to you. And you need to get alternate perspectives. Anyway, thanks for watching and supporting. Bye for now.